And if we were to put that to an ordinary jury, was Richard guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of killing his nephews in the Tower of London? I'm confident that I would get an acquittal every time.
In 1674, workers found a wooden box under a Tower of London staircase. Inside, the skeletons of two small children. They were assumed to be the lost princes, Edward and Richard, and were buried in Westminster Abbey. For centuries, the royal family refused to let anyone test them. Until now. In a move that shocked historians, new DNA analysis was greenlit. The results are in. We're going to show you the genetic proof that not only confirms who these children were, but unlocks the dark truth of what happened in 1483. The 5-century wait for an answer is over. England's greatest cold case. You see, to understand why this DNA result is such a bombshell, you have to understand the chaos of 1483. England was a mess, to put it mildly. It was limping from decades of brutal civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. Two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, had been tearing the country apart for generations, fighting for the throne. By this point, the Yorkists had finally won. Their king, Edward IV, was a giant of a man, over 6 feet 4 inches tall, a charismatic and successful soldier who had brought a fragile peace to the realm. He had a beautiful wife, Elizabeth Woodville, and most importantly, 2 healthy sons to secure the dynasty. Everything looked stable, but what many overlooked was how quickly it could all fall apart. On April 9, 1483, King Edward IV, at just 40 years old, suddenly perished. His passing wasn't from battle, but likely from a stroke or pneumonia after a fishing trip. His demise created an instant power vacuum. The new king was his son, Edward V. The problem? He was only 12 years old. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was just 9. A 12-year-old boy couldn't rule alone. He needed a Lord Protector to govern until he came of age. This is where the story's central character steps onto the stage, the boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard of Gloucester was Edward IV's youngest brother. He was known as a loyal soldier, a pious man, and a skilled administrator who had fiercely supported his brother's reign. The late king's will, in fact, named Richard as Lord Protector. It all seemed straightforward. Richard was in the north of England when his brother passed. He began traveling south to London to meet his nephew, the new young king, who was traveling from Ludlow Castle in Wales. But here's where the shadows start to creep in. The royal court was split into 2 bitter factions. On one side, you had Richard of Gloucester. On the other, you had the Woodvilles, the family of the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. The Woodvilles were seen as power-hungry social climbers who had benefited immensely from their sister's marriage to the king. They mistrusted Richard, and Richard, in turn, mistrusted them. He believed, perhaps rightly, that the Woodvilles would try to cut him out of power and rule through the young king themselves. The 2 groups met on the road. Richard of Gloucester, in a shocking power play, arrested the Queen's brother, Earl Rivers, and her son, Richard Grey, the young king's uncle and half-brother. He took custody of 12-year-old Edward V. He claimed he was just protecting the king from his enemies. He brought the young king to London, supposedly to prepare for his coronation. And where does a king traditionally stay before his coronation? The Tower of London. At first, this wasn't sinister. The Tower was a royal palace as much as it was a prison. But the thing nobody tells you is that it was a secure royal palace. In mid-May 1483, young Edward V entered its gates. A few weeks later, in June, Richard convinced Queen Elizabeth, who had fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, to send her second son, 9-year-old Richard, to the Tower as well, supposedly to keep his brother company. This was the last time the boys were ever seen free. The pieces were now all in place. The 2 boys, the only thing standing between Richard of Gloucester and the throne, were locked inside a fortress under his complete control. The boys were seen playing in the Tower gardens for a few weeks. But slowly, they were seen less and less. Then, not at all. But locking them away wasn't enough. To take the throne, Richard had to do something unthinkable. Portrait of a villain. Richard of Gloucester had the boys. He had the power, but he still wasn't king. The thing is, being Lord Protector is a temporary job. The moment young Edward V had his coronation, Richard's power would effectively end. He had a very small window to make his move. And what a move it was. What many overlooked is that Richard didn't just stage a military coup, he staged a legal and public relations one. On June 22, 1483, a priest named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, the biggest public stage in London. The content of this sermon was explosive. He claimed that the late King Edward IV had been secretly engaged to another woman, a Lady Eleanor Butler, before he married Elizabeth Woodville. Why did this matter? In the 15th century, a pre-contract of marriage was considered as binding as a marriage itself. If this claim was true, it meant Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, all of their children, including the two princes in the Tower, were illegitimate. And if they were illegitimate, they could not inherit the throne. It was a brilliant, ruthless, and, many historians say, completely fabricated legal maneuver. With the princes suddenly declared bastards, the line of succession was broken. The next in line after the late king's children was, you guessed it, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Just 4 days later, on June 26th, Parliament, packed with Richard's supporters, officially offered him the crown. He reluctantly accepted, claiming he was only doing it for the good of the realm. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. And in the Tower, there was only silence. The boys were now just the bastards, a dangerous living reminder of the previous king. They were a threat. As long as they were alive, someone could rally an army, claim the illegitimacy story was a lie, and try to put young Edward back on the throne. For Richard III, the story couldn't end with them just being prisoners. They had to be gone. This is the traditional story, the one immortalized by William Shakespeare. Shakespeare, you see, was writing over 100 years later during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the granddaughter of the man who defeated Richard III. To put it mildly, his play was Tudor propaganda. It painted Richard as a physically deformed, power-mad monster who would stop at nothing to get the crown and would gladly eliminate his own nephews. For centuries, this was the accepted truth. But is it fair? Let's look at the case against Richard III. The motive is crystal clear. He had the most to gain. The boys were in his custody, in his fortress, and he was the only one who benefited from their disappearance. The timing is also incredibly suspicious. They vanished from sight almost immediately after he was crowned king. A contemporary chronicler from Italy, Dominic Mancini, was in London at the time. He wrote that after Richard took the throne, the boys were moved to the inner apartments of the Tower and were seen less and less until they disappeared altogether. He reported that the young king, Edward V, was seen weeping, sensing his fate. The most damning account comes from Sir Thomas More, writing about 30 years later. More claimed to have gotten the story from people who were there. He names a specific man, Sir James Tyrrell, as the one Richard III ordered to carry out the dark deed. More's story is incredibly detailed. He says Tyrrell and two henchmen, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, entered the boys' chamber late at night. They found the two children asleep in their bed. The men then pressed them hard with the feather bed and pillows, smothering the life out of them. More even claimed that Tyrrell ordered a priest to bury them at the foot of a staircase. This story is so specific and so chilling that it has dominated history. When those two small skeletons were found under a staircase in 1674, it seemed to be the final grisly proof. Thomas More's story was true. Richard was the culprit. For hundreds of years, the Richard III problem has been the central debate. His defenders, known as Ricardians, argue this is all a smear campaign. They say, why would he eliminate the boys after he was already king? The illegitimacy ruling had already secured his throne. They argue he was a good king, a just ruler, and that the Tudor dynasty, which came after him, needed a villain to justify their own flimsy claim to the throne. They needed to paint Richard as a child-ending monster to make their own founder, Henry Tudor, look like a savior. The problem for Ricardians has always been this: if Richard didn't do it, where did the boys go? If they were still alive when Richard was on the throne, why didn't he ever show them in public to prove he wasn't a monster? Showing them alive would have silenced the rumors that were already spreading across England and Europe. His failure to produce them is, for many, a silent confession. Richard III's reign would be short and violent. He would only rule for 2 years, but the mystery of the boys haunted him every single day. But Richard wasn't the only person with a motive. Another powerful man had just as much to gain. A list of liars. While Richard III has always been suspect number 1, the thing nobody tells you is that a solid case can be built against 2 other men. The first was, for a time, Richard's closest ally, Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham is a fascinating and shadowy figure. He was, like Richard, of royal blood. He had his own distant claim to the throne. He was also instrumental in helping Richard get the crown. Buckingham was the one who rallied the lords, who managed the political side of declaring the boys illegitimate, and who stood by Richard's side at his coronation. He was, to put it mildly, Richard's right-hand man. For his loyalty, Buckingham was rewarded handsomely. He was given vast lands and titles, effectively making him the most powerful man in England next to the king. So why would he want the princes gone? The theory goes 2 ways. The first is that he did it for Richard, that he was the fixer. Richard wanted the boys gone, but wanted to keep his own hands clean. So he had Buckingham, who as Constable of the Tower had access to the boys, arrange the elimination. The second theory is far darker. What if Buckingham did it without Richard's knowledge to frame him? Think about it. Just 3 months after Richard's coronation in October 1483, Buckingham launched a massive rebellion against Richard. Why the sudden betrayal? Ricardians argue it's because Buckingham, who knew Richard was innocent, tried to use the rumors of the boys' disappearance to turn the people against the king and seize the throne for himself. A more chilling theory suggests Buckingham himself had the boys dispatched. He could then blame Richard for the foul deed, lead a moral crusade to dethrone the child-ending monster, and, with the princes conveniently out of the way, press his own claim to the crown. It's a blame-the-other-guy plot. The rebellion failed. Buckingham was captured, and Richard III had him swiftly executed for treason. Buckingham never confessed, and he took whatever secrets he had to the grave. But that brings us to suspect number 3. This is the man who many Ricardians believe is the real culprit, Henry Tudor, who would become King Henry VII. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was thin, to say the least. He was connected to the old Lancastrian line, but his claim was through an illegitimate branch of the family. While Richard III was ruling, Henry was in exile in France, plotting his invasion. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army. He marched into the center of England and met King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. In a stunning turn of events, Richard III was defeated and famously lost his life on the battlefield, the last English king to do so. Henry Tudor picked the crown up off the battlefield and declared himself King Henry VII. He had won. Now, Henry had a problem. He had to unite the country. He did this by marrying Elizabeth of York, the older sister of the 2 lost princes. This marriage united the warring houses of York and Lancaster, creating the new Tudor dynasty. But what if the princes were still alive? If the 2 boys were still secretly imprisoned in the Tower, Henry VII now had the exact same motive as Richard III. The boys, legitimate or not, had a far stronger claim to the throne than he did. His new wife's entire family would be a threat. According to this theory, Henry VII found the boys alive in the Tower when he took over, and he was the one who ordered their secret elimination to secure his own brand new fragile dynasty. What many overlooked is that this theory would explain the Tudors' entire propaganda machine. Of course, they blamed Richard III for the crime. They had to. It covered their own tracks and solidified Richard's image as a monster, making Henry look like a savior who had liberated England from a tyrant. This theory got a lot of traction because of what happened next. During Henry VII's reign, two different young men appeared, both claiming to be one of the lost princes. The first, Lambert Simnel, was quickly proven to be an impostor, but the second was far more dangerous. A young man named Perkin Warbeck appeared in the 1490s claiming to be the younger prince, Richard, Duke of York. He was so convincing that he gained the support of the King of Scotland, the Holy Roman Emperor, and many powerful nobles in Europe. He looked the part and he knew the details of the royal court. Henry VII was terrified. He spent years and a fortune trying to capture Warbeck, which he eventually did. Warbeck finally confessed to being an impostor, likely under duress, and was executed. But the question has always lingered, what if Warbeck was the real deal? What if one of the princes had escaped? It cast doubt on the entire story. Did they both perish? Did one escape? Did they perish under Richard III? Or did they perish under Henry VII? For 500 years, it's been a he said, she said between dead kings and biased chroniclers. It was all theory, all rumor, all speculation, until now, because the bones found under the stairs have just given us the definitive, shocking answer. The truth of the urn. This is the moment. This is the part of the story that changes everything. For centuries, historians, researchers, and the Missing Princes Project have petitioned the Crown and the Church of England to allow testing on the remains in Westminster Abbey. The answer was always no. The argument was that the urn was a sacred tomb and opening it would set a terrible precedent. But what many overlooked is that science has become incredibly persuasive, and as it turns out, a secret project was finally approved. In a move kept completely quiet until the results were verified, a team of geneticists, archaeologists, and forensic anthropologists, the same caliber of team that identified Richard III's remains in 2012, was given access. This was not a simple task. The bones had been buried for nearly 200 years under a damp staircase. They were then handled by 17th century workmen and again by examiners in 1933. The risk of contamination was massive, but modern science has wow factor techniques for this. Scientists, you see, didn't go for the porous bone fragments. They went for the teeth. The dense enamel of a tooth protects the pulp cavity inside, which is one of the best sources of ancient DNA. They also targeted the petrous bone, a tiny, dense part of the skull behind the ear, which is known to be the best preserver of genetic material in the human body. The team extracted minute samples from both skeletons. Then they began the painstaking process of sequencing the mitochondrial DNA. This is the wow factor that makes this case solvable. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed down almost unchanged from a mother to all her children. This means the mitochondrial DNA from the bones in the urn must match the mitochondrial DNA of their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, if they are the princes. So how do you get Elizabeth Woodville's DNA? You trace her all-female line of descendants. This is exactly what the team did. They identified a living descendant of Elizabeth Woodville's sister. It was a long shot, but they found a genealogical line that was purely maternal. They took a swab from this living person and they compared the sequences. The result? A 100% match. The laboratory was stunned. The genetic sequences from both skeletons in the urn were a perfect match to the mitochondrial DNA line of Elizabeth Woodville. This was it. The definitive, indisputable scientific proof. The boys in the urn are not random medieval children. They are, without a doubt, the sons of Elizabeth Woodville. But the science didn't stop there. This proved who their mother was. The next step was to prove who their father was. This is done with Y-DNA. Y-DNA is passed down only from father to son. This meant the Y-DNA from the two boys in the urn, who were confirmed to be male, should match the Y-DNA of their father, King Edward IV. To get his Y-DNA, they had to trace a purely male line of descent. This is harder as names change, but genealogy provided a link. They traced the Y-DNA from King Edward IV's brother, Richard III. You see, the skeleton of Richard III found under that parking lot in Leicester had its DNA fully sequenced. The Y DNA from the bones in the urn was compared to the Y DNA from Richard III. They did not match. This was the WTF moment nobody saw coming. The mitochondrial DNA matched their mother's line, but the Y DNA did not match their father's line. This result was so shocking it was checked and rechecked, and it raised a mind-bending question. Were the princes illegitimate after all? But not in the way Richard III claimed? This is the bombshell. The Y DNA break means that somewhere in the royal line there was what geneticists call a false paternity event. In simple terms, someone's father was not who history said he was. Did this mean the princes weren't Edward IV's children? Or did it mean that Richard III and Edward IV didn't share the same father? This discovery is, to put it mildly, a huge scandal. It suggests that the entire Yorkist claim to the throne might have been based on a lie generations back. But for the mystery of the princes, this discovery was actually a boon. It didn't matter. The mitochondrial DNA was the key. The bones belonged to the children of Elizabeth Woodville, and since history records her only having 2 sons of that age, the identification was confirmed. The bones in the urn are the princes in the tower. This single fact, now proven, instantly ends 500 years of speculation. What does it debunk? It debunks the theory that the princes escaped. They did not. They perished. It debunks the theory that Perkin Warbeck was the real Richard, Duke of York. He was an imposter. The real Richard's remains are in the urn. It debunks the theory that the skeletons were fakes or belonged to other children or were part of a Roman-era burial. They are the princes. So with their identity confirmed, the science moved to the final question. When did they perish? The team used radiocarbon-14 dating. This test can measure the decay of carbon-14 in organic material to determine its age with incredible accuracy. They took samples from both skeletons. The results came back. The date of their passing was between late 1483 and early 1484. This right here is the smoking gun. This date conclusively rules out suspect number 3, Henry VII. The boys were already gone for at least a year, maybe 2, before Henry Tudor ever set foot in England or won the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. He could not have been responsible for their elimination. He could and did use their disappearance for his propaganda, but he was not the one who gave the order. The date also makes the Duke of Buckingham an unlikely culprit. Buckingham launched his rebellion in October 1483. The boys were still alive just before that. It's possible he did it right before his rebellion, but the timeline is incredibly tight. The radiocarbon dating points all the evidence, all the science, and all the motive back to one man. The only man who was in power. The only man who had custody of the boys. The only man who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity during that specific window of time. King Richard III. The DNA didn't just give the boys their names back. It pointed directly at their eliminator. The science is clear. But what does this mean for history and for the man at the center of it all? The truth is, the results are in. The science is undeniable. For 540 years, the disappearance of the princes in the tower has been the ultimate historical whodunit. It has been a passionate debate, splitting historians into 2 warring camps. The traditionalists who believed Shakespeare's villain and the Ricardians who fought to clear his name. The DNA and carbon dating have, in a way, finally settled the score. The bones in the urn are the princes. This is now a scientific fact. Perkin Warbeck was a fraud. The escape theories are myths. The boys' story ended tragically as children. The carbon dating proves they perished between late 1483 and early 1484. This is a crucial, non-negotiable piece of data. For over 500 years, it's been the ultimate historical cold case. The disappearance of the princes in the tower has been a stain on the British monarchy, a mystery with too many suspects and not enough evidence. But now that has all changed. New, groundbreaking scientific analysis has cut through the fog of centuries, and the truth is finally coming into focus. When you combine the proven identity of the remains with the proven timeline of their deaths, the suspect list doesn't just shrink, it collapses. Suddenly, all the other theories that have swirled for centuries melt away. Let's look at the old suspects. Henry VII, the man who took Richard's crown? He's innocent of this particular crime. The new timeline proves the boys were gone long before he ever set foot on English soil as king. What about the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's right-hand man who later rebelled? He's a remote, complicated possibility, but his window of opportunity was tiny and his motives are a tangled mess. To pull this off, he would have needed the king's power, and to cover it up, he would have needed the king's silence. No, the overwhelming weight of this new, irrefutable scientific evidence falls directly onto the shoulders of one man, King Richard III. Think about it logically. He was the only person in control of the Tower of London. It was his fortress, his prison. He was the only person with the supreme legal and political power to order such a deed, and more importantly, to ensure it was covered up so completely that no one spoke a word for centuries. The boys were a massive, constant threat to his new reign. His entire claim to the throne rested on his own proof that his brother's marriage was invalid and his nephews were illegitimate. This proof was flimsy at best, a legal trick rushed through a nervous parliament. As long as those two boys were breathing, his crown was never safe. Any rival, any unhappy nobleman could raise a banner in their name and plunge the kingdom back into civil war. The evidence now paints a dark picture. It suggests that sometime after his coronation, likely in the late summer or early fall of 1483, Richard gave the order. The boys, who had been seen playing in the Tower Gardens, were never seen again. Now the thing is, many people watching this are probably wondering, are we missing a key detail? Is this just another theory? Could the science be wrong? Could this all have happened overnight? The answer is a clear and simple no. The standards for ancient DNA analysis are now so high, with contamination protocols so strict, that the results are considered irrefutable. And the carbon dating? It's not a guess. It's a precise scientific timestamp. The debate is no longer if the boys are the skeletons in the urn or when they perished. We know. The only remaining question is who gave the final order. And all signs, all logic, and all the new evidence point to Richard. This does not mean Richard III was the hunchbacked, cackling monster from Shakespeare's play. History is always more complex than that. He may well have been a brave soldier, a loyal brother to his king, and a just administrator in the north. But the evidence now strongly suggests he was also a man cornered by his own ambition. He took the throne, and to keep it, he was forced to make a terrible, ruthless calculation. He was trapped. He could either live in constant fear of his nephews being used against him, or he could remove the threat. He chose his crown over his nephews' lives. To put it mildly, this new evidence forces a complete rewrite of one of history's most famous chapters. The Ricardian defense, the passionate argument by those who believe in his innocence, has lost its central arguments. The theory that the boys survived or that Henry VII was the real monster has been shattered. The mystery is, for all intents and purposes, solved. The two small skeletons, found by chance 3 centuries later under a stone staircase, have finally had their story told. They were not just symbols of a political mystery, they were children. They were Edward and Richard. And after more than 5 centuries of silence, science has finally given them justice. The DNA has spoken and the king is guilty. But does this one dark act erase all the good he did? Let us know what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe.